I think if a white man had hosted the MASH report, it would not have created the same ructions that it created. Because I think there is still, there is definitely still a sense of like, how dare this have these opinions?
Hi, I'm Harry Clarke-Ezzidio, policy reporter at the New Statesman, but today I'm not here to talk about policy because I am joined by comedian and bread roll dodger extraordinaire Nish Kumar, who's currently on tour right now. Thanks for joining me, Nish.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
No worries. So you're currently on tour, as I said, after recently stepping back from the MASH report and what later became Late Night MASH.
Yeah.
But considering the current news agenda with potential World War III, Partygate, everything going on, do you kind of miss the weekly rough and tumble of the TV comedy circuit?
I mean, no. I miss working with my friends. Like, I definitely miss the collegiate atmosphere of it, but I definitely don't miss, the prospect of having to sit there and go, God, how do we turn out 5 minutes of funny stuff about the invasion of Ukraine and the looming prospect of nuclear Armageddon? That, I don't miss that. I don't miss that. Because, when you do stand up, you can sort of engage with it in a slightly more, you can talk about it in a more discursive way. If you have a show that is sort of filled with 85 minutes of jokes, you can have a little breather where you talk about these things. But obviously in a half hour or 45-minute TV show, it's got to be funny. There's literally no point in me repeating what a newsreader has said. There's got to be jokes in there. And that's the thing that I don't miss. Definitely the thing that I don't miss is the point, it's normally at quite late on in an evening where someone's like, we just don't have a joke here. And everybody, I'm looking at previously a room full, but certainly the last couple of years, Zoom window full of comedy writers who are just looking at me like this. And all of us are going, I mean, this is all just horrific.
It's quite depressing, yeah.
Yeah, there's no good news currently.
That's the real news. It's really interesting talking about trying to sort of find the balance, because there's been a lot of discussion in recent months over where the line is drawn in comedy when you sort of go about joking about events of the past or whatever's on the current news agenda. How do you, I suppose, go about that yourself personally, trying to find the balance of, making light of a bad situation, but also, I guess, being sensitive to the lived realities that people are going through?
I think you have to have an internal moral compass about these things. And you have to think about who... Listen, I've upset many people.
Really?
You basically have to make peace with either yourself, your God, or both. That the people you're offending are people you're comfortable offending. That's what I think. That's where I think it all comes down. And the other thing that I think is interesting is the idea that this is a newish debate. I actually don't think it is. I think that every generation has had a churn of this same conversation of where is the line in comedy, where is acceptable. When I was young, I remember a kind of, media-fueled hysteria about Chris Morris's Brass Eye. And I remember the same conversations happening again and again. And I remember the anger towards what they were doing, which, for me, I thought was so incredible and brilliant, and I still think is incredible and brilliant. But I think that, in that case, it was a very meta thing where a satire of media hysteria became itself the subject of media hysteria. But these are much older conversations. The NBC pulled the Smothers Brothers comedy show off the air in the 1960s, and so we are going over these things. Carlin, Lenny Bruce, Richard Pryor were all imprisoned on obscenity charges at points in their career. So we are sort of going over the same conversations again and again. I think in terms of how you balance talking about sensitive subjects in a way that's funny, that is all down to your internal moral compass and having conversations about where you're comfortable drawing the line. And and I think in stand-up, in a way, it's almost easier because the audience can guide you, and if you feel the audience pushback, you have to make a decision as to whether you want to change the joke or whether you're comfortable with that pushback and you want to incorporate that into the comedy that you're doing.
In a recent interview of yours, you kind of spoke about how we're kind of in the midst of this comedy culture war fiasco right now, but you actually said that prior to it sort of becoming a focal point for many people, members of the public, there was actually like many internal discussions about what was eventually going to become the culture war. But I suppose, having prior knowledge of what was about to begin, did you really anticipate that it become the hot point that it is now? Or has it kind of surprised you just how sort of bad it's really got?
Yeah, it surprises me how much interest there is in the content of comedy shows, given everything else that's going on in the world. Like, there's still a plague and there's a world war looming. And the idea that people get so excited about comedy in one way or another, to me, seems like it's slightly skewed priorities, I guess.
That's fair. And I suppose it was pretty much exemplified in around the Brexit time, when obviously like a few years later it led to you being pelted. It led to you having to use your quick reactions to dodge a bread roll. But I suppose you've been kind of marked in the media as like the personification of everything that's wrong with modern woke comedy.
Yes.
Why?
There seems to be this idea that, you know, I'm a sort of manifestation of a particular type of comedy that some people find distasteful, and I just couldn't care less about their opinion. I'm delighted to have upset those people, but I think that, you know, I do think the only thing that's a more serious and worthwhile thing to draw out of this discussion is my perception that the reason that I came under particular scrutiny was because of my ethnicity, and I don't feel like that's a particularly contentious thing to say. When you look at some of the sort of comments that were made about me, it felt like there was something much more loaded happening in some of the criticism. You know, the phrase anti-British has been used by some people. Andrew Neil.
Yeah. I was going to assist you with that one, but...
you know, and you sort of go... Interestingly, that comment was specifically in relation to a clip from a children's television show that had already been on television, but when I was attached to it, it became anti-British. In the Times, Matthew Parris used the phrase, said that I was biting the hand that fed me, which made me feel uneasy. And then sometime later, Matthew Parris said that Ayanna Pressley, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez needed to show more gratitude to their host country, and used that phrase. And now, you know, those are 4 elected representatives of that country's government, and yet they were still being told that they needed to show more gratitude to the host country. And again, we young people of colour, we think that we're facing these things for the first time. We're not. It's just the same conversation going over and over again about who gets to have an opinion about, if you live in a white country, who gets to express an opinion about that country itself. And I sometimes get trapped in this idea that I think, I can't believe this is happening to me. I can't believe this is happening now. It's not happening to me. It's happening to all of us, and it's happened again and again and again. We're locked in a sort of Groundhog Day of racism. And what you hope is, like Bill Murray in Groundhog Day, the country makes slow, incremental progress, so the conversations become slightly less loaded. And like, you know, in the time, my mum came to this country 50 years ago in February, so 1972. You know, you hope that some progress has been made. And, you know, for people of my mum's generation, they're afraid of getting their heads kicked in by the National Front. So hopefully we've moved on. We've moved slightly further away from that.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that, because you said that you were perhaps a bit naive about the state of the country.
Definitely.
Back in 2017 when you were making your comedy about Brexit. And I suppose the country's capacity to debate it through the medium of comedy or in just a civil way. What's your reading of the country now? Where do you think we are?
Well, it's hard to not feel like there's a sort of generational tussle going on where it feels like, but I mean, it's not even as clear cut as simply a generational tussle. It's hard. It sort of feels a bit like there is a tension between the values that the country likes to project it has and the values the country actually has. And, you know, there's a lot of hand-wringing about Ukrainian refugees and going, is this the country that we are now? And you sort of go, yes, it is. This idea that the government, you know, this idea that the government would be wringing its hands over the possibility of refugees coming into this country is completely consistent with the last 10 years of politics. You know, they can keep rebranding it, but at the end of the day, this is still fundamentally a government with the same DNA as the government behind the Windrush scandal. There's that on one hand. Whatever that section of the country is definitely rubbing up against another section of the country that is trying to push the country forward. You know, I think it's interesting to like ask the question of what is a patriot? Is it somebody who is constantly trying to recapture an imagined past glory? Or is a real patriot somebody who's trying to improve the country and move the country forward and create real progress? I would say it's the latter, but that's the sort of thing that gets bread chucked at me.
That's what you get for speaking up. Got to get back in your box. But no, you spoke of something really interesting that I think a lot of people from minority backgrounds can relate to, in that, you know, when you are the child of when you're second generation immigrant, you tend to get put in a box of having these certain opinions, and like you said earlier, of how you should be grateful and have a certain amount of gratitude, and I suppose know your place in a way. And the way that you kind of become demonized and made public enemy number one by certain factions of the media, has that, you know, all that abuse from the followers and the people that read those outlets, has that kind of damaged your sense of identity? Because you describe yourself as, you know, just a very normal British Asian man who feels very patriotic and loves this country, loves it enough to criticize it, warts and all. I'm just curious as to what effect that's kind of had on your sort of identity and your perception of Britishness.
It's definitely made me feel less connected to Britain and Britishness, definitely, because you can sort of intellectualize these things to a certain extent, but when you're sort of being told by, and not just, you know, we sort of talk a lot about social media abuse, but when you're sort of being told by quite powerful media organisations to get back in your box, you start to think, what? I mean, why should I feel connected, you know, in a lot of ways? But, you know, that's why I found, you know, simple gestures that communicated something complicated, like the Bristol protests and chucking the statue of Colston in the water, and the England football players taking a knee and the white players standing shoulder to shoulder with the black players. We've all sort of very quickly forgotten about the fact that at that point they were subjected to a huge amount of criticism, some of it coming from the government itself. You know, those kind of moments are moments where I feel like re-engaged and re-inspired. But, you know, I also sort of, I have to try and fight to stop feeling too sorry for myself, because ultimately, like, you know, there are people who are doing the actual work, you know, the actual activists and the actual people on the front lines of trying to move things along. You've always got to keep in perspective, at the end of the day, you're just doing your little jokes.
That's fair.
You're just doing your little jokes, and you must always keep a sense of perspective of your overall contribution to the culture.
When the MASH report was on the BBC, obviously, despite having relatively modest viewing figures, it rubbed quite a lot of people up the wrong way, especially in the government. And it was cancelled after 4 seasons, and the official line being that, you know, there just wasn't enough room in the budget.
Yeah.
But of course, it really, I suppose, landed quite a punch with a lot of people due to its really brash political content. Do you feel as though it's really overt political commentary, and it being seen as like the mouthpiece of the left just hammering the government played a part in, I suppose, the BBC commissioners not perhaps fighting harder for it to be safe, despite its relative success?
The honest truth is that I don't know. We did well for the BBC in ways that they wanted us to do well. You know, it was a show that was popular with a younger demographic than the corporation traditionally reaches. Though I do think some of that is because some of the metrics are slightly outdated, and you know, it's not like young people didn't watch like Fleabag. Do you know what I mean? Like it's a slight sort of misnomer to say that young people don't watch the BBC. But you know, we did well with like videos going viral and stuff like that. And I've no idea, because you know, there's such an opacity to the decision-making process, and you just have to. But I think, you know, when somebody tells you the BBC can't commission it because they don't have enough money, you go, yeah, I can believe that. George Osborne really did a number on the BBC. That rule change about the over 65s was a perfect piece of. It was a perfect example of how to gut a publicly funded organisation, because it's framed as the BBC is charging people over 65s, but that was a decision that Osborne took. That was part of government cuts. So it's very believable that the BBC wouldn't have any money. I have no idea what happened. I don't really know. Nobody will tell me. I keep asking. Nobody tells me. But I think the MASH report would not have caused the problems it had caused if it had a white host. I really believe that. I think if it had been, you know, and probably a white man as well, because like there's people that were annoyed with me weren't exactly thrilled with Rachel Parris either. But I think if a white man had hosted the MASH report, it would not have created the same ructions that it created, because I think there is still, you know, there is definitely still a sense of like, how dare this have these opinions? But you know, at the same time, we got 4 series on TV. Yeah, we got 4 series, and I'm really proud of the stuff that we did, and especially the 4th series, which we made in everyone's houses in lockdown, is something that it's something that I'm really proud of. Like, I'm really just proud of the basic fact that we were able to make the show, and I'm also really proud of the content of it. You know, I feel like we managed to find a tone that worked in that particularly weird time. You know, we were only, I think, a week and a half into the first national lockdown, and so, you know, in another way, nobody has a God-given right to be on television.
Which is really interesting, because obviously the time in which it was cancelled, around that time, Tim Davie was sort of being reported in the media as sort of having it out to sort of clear out the perceived left-wing bias within BBC comedy. And that was kind of co-opted as the official reason for why the show was cancelled. And you pushed for a clarification from the BBC, asking for a statement to be made to sort of really, I suppose, clear up the record and sort of give the proper reason of why it was cancelled.
Yeah.
Why do you think that seeking that clarification was so important?
We were given an official reason, and those remarks were actually attributed to Tim Davie, but I think people were slightly playing fast and loose with some other things that he'd said. And actually, when he was interviewed by June Sarpong, he kind of clarified a few of those remarks at the time. And then it was in February. The Sun ran an article in February 2021 that said that I will say this: the headline "Nish Mash Bosh" is solid.
Decent.
That is solid stuff. But that was the Sun said that sources close to the Director General had said that he had personally intervened. And I just thought it was important. I just think it's an important point of principle that it's clarified that the Director General of the BBC didn't get rid of a television programme because of its perceived political leanings. You know, I just think that sets a very... If you don't like the show, say you don't like the show and you're getting rid of the show because you don't think the comedy is good, that sets a really weird precedent. But I've asked the BBC, and listen, I'm not short of media organisations wanting to talk to me. I have been the opposite of silenced.
You were at the New Statesman.
New Statesman,
Here you are.
Guardian, New York Times. Both of those organisations, in interviews that I conducted with them, subsequently went on to try and push the BBC for a clarification, but they wouldn't. Now, I think probably that is just a consequence of the BBC having a policy that it just doesn't comment on internal matters. But I don't think in this instance the opacity is helpful for people, because I think people should know one way or another. You know, we just moved to a different channel. It's far from the end of the world.
I mean, you described it as a bit of a useful myth for it to be out there. And I suppose, like, you know, a bit on since that all came out, do you feel as though it's kind of had an effect? I mean, maybe some of the comedians that you know within the sort of circles of that, do you think that's kind of had an effect, that sort of idea of, well, you can't be too controversial on the BBC because you might get cancelled or you might get deplatformed? What do you think the effect of that sort of myth has been?
Well, I mean, I don't know. There are so many checks and balances when you do something on the BBC anyway. You know, I think this idea that, like, the BBC has this sort of, is like basically a kind of ceaseless rolling 7-day communist orgy, which, you know, gangbangs are interrupted by staged readings from the Capitol, could not be further from the truth. There's a lot of checks and balances in place to make sure that you can't just outright just produce pieces of propaganda. You know, our Prime Minister gets away with lying in Parliament. You know, like, and meantime, you know, somebody who's doing a Radio 4 comedy show is getting compliance notes back from lawyers saying, well, technically, we can't ascribe the chicken's motivations to crossing the road to one specific factor, and we need to make it clear that there may have been a number of factors at work in the chicken's decision to take that decision to cross the road. And meanwhile, Johnson's like, yeah, well, Keir Starmer's a pedo protector, and everyone's like, oh, that, I wish you hadn't said that, but we can't really stop you. It's not ideal, but I don't know. And then Dawn Butler calls him a liar, and everyone's like, right, get out, Dawn. Immediately, out, Butler. You're out. I think there's so much scrutiny and work that's done to stop the BBC from broadcasting falsehoods. I mean, we called him a liar and a racist on television because it's demonstrably provable. It's demonstrably provable that Boris Johnson was sacked from a job for lying and has used racial epithets in his journalism. And, you know, when people say you need to read the full articles, I've read those articles many, many times, and there is no redeeming, context to them. I think that I'm not sure that this has had any great effect on the BBC beyond the fear that is already there. There is a constant fear at the organisation of appearing to be biased to one side of the political spectrum, and people work very hard to try and make sure that that's not the case. But as I've frequently said, I think the danger with the BBC is thinking that you can appease people that are out to destroy you. You know, you can't reason with organisations like the Mail and Murdoch's papers because they're objective, and it's not. I mean, you could. There's probably there's a way of interpreting it as an ideological thing. The idea that for people with a particular political perspective, it doesn't serve them well to have a publicly funded broadcaster. But also, just in simple terms of market forces, they're trying to eliminate their strongest competition. You know, the BBC website is a trusted news source, the BBC's news output, and also the fact that the BBC is still a kind of international kite mark of quality in the arts and entertainment. I can't believe that we're still having to explain to people after all this time that, like, they don't have good motivations for getting rid of the BBC. And, you know, it's something that lots of left-wing people lots of left-wing people are very, very much struggling to defend the BBC. And I understand and sympathise with a lot of those things. But what I would say is that you never want to find yourself siding with the Daily Mail. And that's a great rule for life.
It is.
That's a fantastic rule. You could live your life by that principle and do pretty well for yourself on a day-to-day basis.
Well, it's really interesting that you bring up impartiality in the BBC, because I suppose, like, the BBC's problems with impartiality go well beyond comedy. Like, they go back to Brexit and its coverage of that, and has existed well before that. And I suppose, like you said in an earlier interview and just now, that I suppose, like, the BBC's aim to try and maybe appease certain factions of the media that will never be content with it until it becomes a propaganda machine, perhaps for the government, or just ceases to exist in any meaningful form. I suppose with the current existential threats towards the BBC in its current form, how do you see things playing out in the future?
I mean, I don't know that the existing version of the BBC can survive another Conservative government. I mean, it's very interesting because as much as people moan about the BBC, whenever we actually get towards a point of pushing a button that might get rid of the licence fee, suddenly everyone gets very agitated. And you know, during the pandemic, we saw the utility putting learning resources online for parents who are homeschooling children. You know, that is the kind of thing the corporation does incredibly well. In particularly in regards to like the conversation on the left about the BBC, if you have family that are not from Britain, you understand that most things about Britain people do not like, because largely British people turning up in your country that wasn't Britain, that was never a good sign. That they weren't there, you know, they were there bringing smallpox and colonialism. And so, and people are often, will always say like, why are British people always villains in films? And you're like, because we're the villains in history. Do you not understand that? And so there are very few things that like, that have, in terms of like soft diplomatic power, there's very few things that Britain produces that really have this kind of, that have a sort of unambiguous, even the sport of cricket, so beloved in India, still has the like slight ring of colonialism to it. You know, it's only there because of the colonisers. But for some reason, for whatever reason, even though again, the BBC's soft power is largely facilitated by the spread of the English language because of colonialism, people have massive affection for the BBC. So maybe that's why I still love it. Because like, I know that like my family in India still have this kind of respect for the BBC. When you talk to people who make television in America, they're like, oh man, the BBC is so incredible. You know, the comedy that it produces, and you know, people are so excited and thrilled by the prospect of that. I fear for its future under another Conservative government.
And I suppose like the real also stinger is like the question of impartiality isn't necessarily one of a particular skew one way or the other, but I suppose like how impartiality is covered in terms of comedy, because comedy and the arts in general, I don't think it's any secret that to anyone that it has maybe a liberal or left-leaning bias or skew. But I suppose in the age of, you know, social media and in the age of our current Conservative government, the question is how that is, I suppose, carried out in the future, because comedy more than anything, because we did an interview recently with Andy Statesman, he said that, you know, comedy more than anything is
I'm wearing Statesman on my socks right now.
Oh, really?
Am I wearing my bugle socks? No, I've got my bugle hat. Statesman.
Perfect.
I like to keep Andy Zaltzman. I like to keep one piece of clothing with Andy Zaltzman's picture on me at all times. Andy Zaltzman and Little Sims are my North Stars.
That's fair. No, but he was saying that, you know, more than anything, comedy is anti-establishment. And if you go back to, you know, the 2000s when the Labour government was in power, I mean, one of the biggest shows on the BBC was The Thick of It, which had Peter Capaldi basically cosplaying as Alistair Campbell. Like, I suppose, like, do you ever, it seems as though we're kind of just stuck in a bit of an endless loop.
If you want more Conservative comedy, I would advise the Conservative Party of Britain to get better at losing elections. Because that will, if you elect a Labour government, the majority of comedians who do political comedy will go after the government. That's how it always works. I grew up, you know, I was 12 years old when Blair was elected in '97, and the political comedy I remember at the time was all targeted at New Labour. And you're right, the most enduring piece of political satire from that period was The Thick of It. And when you rewatch bits of The Thick of It, I mean, I think the film In the Loop is sensational, and it has, you know, it's still satire with real teeth, and there's not that many films that really have engaged, especially when you compare it to like the Vietnam War. There's not that many films that have engaged with the Iraq War and the lead up to the Iraq War, and so it still feels very fresh because of the paucity of other material. But it was all about the Labour. The comedians will go after whoever is in power at that particular point. But yeah, I mean, just lose more elections, Tories.
And just finally, of course, you're on tour. This is a
Yes.
new era for Nish.
The new era.
3 years post bread roll incident.
Yeah.
What is the new show about? What is this new Nish era about?
Well, the show is is taking in some of the things we've talked about via the prism of the bread roll, because it's a really goofy story, but then it is a way into a more serious conversation about, because I think with me, there's a thing where you're like, ultimately, I'm fine, and I'm, my career is going well, and I'm okay. But it's so because of that, it's a funny story that has a fine ending, and it's a window through which you can have conversations about who gets to have an opinion in the country, and the kind of toxic strain of nationalism that's taken hold here in America, in India, in Russia, of course, most pressingly, concerningly to the world at the moment. Yeah, so it's like a silly window onto more serious issues. And it also allows me to talk about things like, the impact that having death threats has on your mental health, and the impact having death threats had on my mental health, and how unwilling I was to engage with that. And, how people particularly men my age, are very good at saying things like, guys, come on, take care of your mental health. But then when things are actually happening in your life that are actually really difficult, you don't do any of the stuff. You just say all of it. You don't. I maintain anyone who has had sex with a man in his mid-30s deserves a written apology, because we're very, very good at saying a lot of the right things, not so hot at putting some of those right things into practice. Luckily for me, there's not many written apologies that need to be done. It's not a long job for me. The whole thing is a kind of silly window onto more serious conversations. Why should you respect a government that is more interested in keeping statues up than keeping 170,000 people from dying from a preventable disease? Good fun stuff, guys.
Tickets are cheap.
Tickets are cheap.
Relatively cheap. Cost of living crisis.
Cost of living crisis, yeah. The cost of living crisis could not have come at a worse time for my audience.
I think you should apologise on camera, Nish. The audacity. But that sounds brilliant. A lot of food for thought. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.